Okay, good afternoon. I'm Heather Mason. I'm the legislation editor in the Legislative Drafting Office. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what the editorial team actually do and a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes in the Legislative Drafting Office. So just to sort of where the editorial team fit in. The drafting office is composed of approximately 8 drafters. It varies slightly depending on particular projects that are happening at the time. Sometimes there's people on fixed term contracts come in to do certain projects. But the editorial team is comprised of 1 legislation editor, which is me, and 2 assistant legislation editors or legislation clerks. And we also have Kate, the legislation services consultant, helping us out with various things as well. And the drafting office in Jersey produces all primary and secondary legislation. Okay. So I started as legislation editor in November 2019. Before my appointment, there was 1 legislation clerk who dealt with all the non-drafting tasks. And she's still with us today. She's still legislation clerk and has been absolutely invaluable in helping me sort of set up the role of the editorial team and putting up with my endless questions for the last couple of years. Okay, and then we decided we needed to expand the team slightly. So in the summer of 2020, we appointed a part-time legislation clerk or assistant legislation editor, who again has fitted into the team exceptionally well and is an enormous help to me. So legislation editors were a new thing for Jersey, but have been commonplace in other jurisdictions, particularly Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and now Guernsey as well, since we introduced them to that concept. So the editorial team, what do we actually do? Well, a big part of our role was changing the review process of draft legislation. Legislation has always had a legal review, what used to be known as a peer review, looking at the legal aspects of the draft, and it's always had a formatting review, is it sitting in a template properly? But the editorial review is looking at it from a different perspective. So we're looking at, the title of the legislation. Is the style of it correct? Does it fit in with that family of legislation? Is the amendment numbering correct? Do the varies apply? Are the provisions numbered correctly? We look at if other instruments are cited correctly. Are the cross-references in there right? For example, if a drafter's drafting a piece of legislation, they might remove, say, Article 2 and have to renumber the entire piece of legislation. There's a lot of cross-references to go back and check and see if they've all been amended to the new article numbers. We look at references to office holders, other departments, standard things like grammar, spelling and punctuation. Is the draft written in as plain English as possible? Is it in our Jersey House style? Gender neutral language has been a big addition over the last few years, as in not just he or she, because that's not truly inclusive, it's not gender neutral. So we're looking at ways that we can word the legislation to be fully inclusive. We look at the sequencing of the provisions. Does it all sit properly in the legislation? And do any amendments work? Are they accurate and are they complete? Okay, so we also look at the formatting of the draft and the legislation template. We produce the projets for laws and regulations. We produce signing copies of ministerial orders. We produce and publish adopted versions on the Jersey Law website on the pending tab. We then prepare and send those laws out to Privy Council. We produce made versions of all the legislation, which you can find on the As Enacted tab. And then, most importantly, since the introduction of the legislation Jersey Law, it's now the official Jersey legislation, we produce the official current consolidated legislation on the current tab of the website, and we'll have a little bit more of a look at that later. I've actually stolen this from my cat for the afternoon. It's normally his toy that we play on the floor. So back in 2019, we introduced a new legislation template, and that's where all the legislation is drafted, but it's not only a drafting template. It's used for the whole process of the legislation, through production of the projet, right through to producing the consolidated version of the draft for the website, and every other step in between. And we've been very, very fortunate to have Kate, our legislation services consultant, because she makes lots and lots of changes to that template, bespoke to us to do the things that we actually needed to do specifically in Jersey, and things that the editorial team needed to do, not just the drafters. So I'm just going to go through one or two things that the template allows us to do. So it might come as a surprise to you, but these aren't actual real legislations. We weren't required by law to have a celebration for our anniversary today. But once a drafter has drafted a piece of legislation and it comes to us, if it's been through the States Assembly, it comes to us for publishing. People find it very useful if any laws or any other pieces of legislation are hyperlinked. And this was a big project that we undertook last year, to introduce hyperlinks of all the legislation to every single piece of legislation on the Jersey Law website. And we've got a little tool up there in the templates, hyperlink citations. So we click on that, and as if by magic, it just runs through and it picks out every name of every law, order, regulations, and it makes a hyperlink to the current law on the Jersey Law website. So I said as if by magic. It's not quite magic. It's actually just some very simple tools sitting behind the scenes. So on the actual website, you can see the web address up here. We've got sitting on our L drive just a couple of notepad files, and we've got it. The template basically picks up the start of the web address, then it finds the title that it's looking at, and then it adds the link to the Jersey Law website on the end and creates a hyperlink that way. So there's not anybody sitting behind the scenes creating a separate hyperlink for every single one of those. We're simply running this tool and it does it by itself, which is fantastic. And again, thanks to Kate. Okay, another tool that the template does, it's basically just sitting in a tab in Word, but we've got lots of drafting tools, but then we've got this section here that's specific to the editorial team and runs things that we do. So when we're ready to create a projet, the drafters signed off the final draft and the department have sent it for lodging, we've sent it to the bailiff for its approval for lodging, and we're ready to produce the projet. We just click on that little tool there, and there we go. We've got our regulations ready to be lodged by the Minister for Birthday Parties, who sadly does not exist. Okay, another tool that we use a lot in the office is what we call the Excluded Dictionary. Again, very simple tool. Basically a list of words which are real words, but words that you generally don't want to be using in legislation. And all it does is that if you type one of these words, and Minster was rife on our statute book instead of minister, because it had been misspelt and not picked up, it underlines it in red as if it is an incorrect spelling, which in context it is. Okay, and you can add any words that you like to these. It's constantly updated. Every time a drafter sort of says to me, oh, I nearly called it the daft order rather than the draft order, so we would add daft into there. So really, really useful tool. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk a bit about is the Jersey Law website. Okay, we've been working very closely with the Jersey Legal Information Board and Marcus to help introduce some changes to the website in the way that legislation is presented, to try and make it more accessible to the users of the legislation. So this is just a screen grab. Since the legislation Jersey law was brought into force in September last year, everything on our current law tab is now official. So we've got official consolidated legislation. And part of the job of my team is that as soon as something's brought into force, we consolidate those amendments into the legislation and we publish it on the Jersey Law website. And then users can go in, you can search by subject now, you can search by A to Z. It is very much a work in progress still, the search tools. And as Lucy mentioned earlier, we're hoping to get Point in Time up and running at some point this year, so that you can see not only what the legislation looks like today on the current tab, but what did it look like last month, what did it look like last year. Okay. Now this is what the website looks like to the users, but to our team it generally looks a little bit different. Okay. Behind the scenes, this is how we're uploading legislation to the website. It's just sitting in a SharePoint system. We just need to drop it in there, approve it, and as if by magic, it appears live to the public. So we can do that immediately that something has been brought into force. And generally on the morning, by about 9 o'clock in the morning, by the time something's come into force, we've generally got it up live on that website. Unless, for example, last year, I think there was one came into force on Christmas Day and that had to wait till Boxing Day, but usually it's the same day. Okay, so just to finish off, just sort of a little bit of a brief, very brief, I promise, journey through sort of the progress of a law and how the editorial team fits into that. So at the first stage, we've got drafting. Obviously, the drafters are drafting several drafts, going back and forth with their policy officers, etc., until they get to what they think is a finalist draft. At that point, it comes for review. And there's, as I said before, 3 types of review. Legal review, which is carried out by another drafter, and the editorial and formatting, which are carried out by the editorial team. Once that has been done, the drafter makes changes to the draft based on all those comments. There are usually reasonably large amounts of comments for them to work with, and they'll then agree an absolute final draft with their instructing officer and release it to the instructing officer for lodging. At that point, the instructing officer will upload it to the MD system, where the gref will carry out their checks, and the editorial team will send it to the bailiff for his approval for lodging. Once we've got that approval, we'll produce the projet and send it to the gref, and they will distribute it to States members and publish it on the States Assembly website. In between that stage, in between lodging and the States debate, there will be some possible drafting of amendments, and again, anything that's drafted by the drafter has to come to us for review as well. Then eventually we get to the States Assembly debate. If the States Assembly decide to pass that piece of legislation, we will produce and publish on the website the adopted version on the pending tab if it's a law. And that law will then be sent off to Privy Council with its green ribbon, etc. And if it's regulations, we'll publish it on the As Enacted tab on the website. Once the law has gone back from Privy Council, it's moved from the pending tab to the As Enacted tab. And then when it comes into force, we produce and publish the current version, and we publish it, the official consolidated version, on the current tab on the website. So hopefully everybody knows now where exactly they should be looking for what versions of the legislation. Okay, so that's just a very brief run through of what the editorial team actually do. And I'm now going to hand you over to Kate Hannah, who is our legislation services consultant.